black thing go from left to right, and I thought, I'm going to die out here. No one's ever going to know. I couldn't believe what my eyeballs were showing me. I'll never forget how evil the eyes were. It was horrible. I mean, I've never seen nothing that evil.
It ran towards me at a rate that I can't even explain. Turned and stared at me, and this look of, I just want to kill you. I want to say it was human, but it wasn't.
He was yelling at me to grab a gun, grab a gun. I was like, for what? He said, just grab a gun. And there's footprints all the way to the door of my house. It had went inside my garage, all the way to the door.
911, what are you reporting?
Jesus Christ, you better...
Sir?
Zio!
Hello?
Get somebody out here.
What's going on now, sir?
That son of a bitch is about 6'9", I don't know.
Do you see him now, sir?
Yes, I'm looking right at him.
Uh-oh.
You're listening to Sasquatch Chronicles. Check us out online at sasquatchchronicles.com. If you've had an encounter, email me. My email address is wes@sasquatchchronicles.com. Welcome to the show, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight. Got a great show planned for you tonight. Going to be speaking to Dr. John Bindernagel. And John grew up in Ontario, and he got his PhD in biology from the University of Wisconsin. And John's been looking into the Sasquatch subject for, I think, since 1963. I'll have to ask him when he comes on the show, but he's been looking into this for a long time. And I always respect guys like John because it's very taboo in their professional life to look into the Sasquatch. It's a very taboo subject. And John has always looked into it. He's always, he's one of the nicest guys, too, in the Bigfoot world. Probably the nicest guy, to be honest with you. And I always love talking to John. I interviewed him a couple years back at the Beachfoot. But I thought it was important to bring John back on the show and talk about science, talk about the different aspects of Sasquatch. And being a wildlife biologist, it's a great opportunity to ask John questions. And most people don't realize this, but John actually had an encounter, and I'll ask him about that tonight. If you've had an encounter and you'd like to be on the show, shoot me an email. My email address is wes@sasquatchchronicles.com. And if you get a chance, join me tomorrow night. I'll be speaking to Bob Gimlin. It'll be kind of a laid-back setting. I'll be talking to Bob about his life, about Bigfoot, but we'll talk about a lot of things outside of Bigfoot. Most people don't know Bob knew Evel Knievel, and he was good friends with them before he became Evel Knievel. So a lot of cool things coming up. It'll be a little bit different type of show than what you're used to. I interviewed Bob, back in, I think it was in the 80s, episode 87, I think. I'll have to go back and double check that, but it was around that time. And we talked about the Patterson-Gimlin film. We talked about how they went down and filmed it. He talked about his relationship with Roger Patterson. But I thought it'd be a cool opportunity just to talk to Bob about his life. So if you get a chance, hang out tomorrow night with us. And Russell Accord will be on there. We'll be talking about the International Bigfoot Conference and, really focusing on Bob. It should be a cool night. I hope you enjoy it. Let's jump into it tonight. I want to welcome Dr. John Bindernagel to the show. John, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for being here.
Well, thank you, Wes.
And for the audience out there, if they go to sasquatchbiologist.org, you can pick up both of John's books, The Discovery of the Sasquatch, and then that was back in 2010. And then in 1998, he wrote a book, North America's Great Ape, the Sasquatch, a wildlife biologist look at the continent's most misunderstood mammal. Definitely check it out, sasquatchbiologist.org. And for the audience, too, if they go to YouTube and type in John Bindernagel, you'll find his YouTube channel, and I'll put a link to the website. I highly recommend people go to John's YouTube channel. He does presentations on, and they're very professionally done, John. He does presentations on the Sasquatch, and they're very informative. And, John, as you and I were saying before we went on air, as I was telling you, you do such a great job at dumbing the subject down. I don't know if that's a proper term to use, but you don't talk above anyone. But I would imagine a scientist could sit and watch it. I would imagine someone who's not a scientist could sit and watch it and get information from your videos. And the other thing, too, is and I wish I really had this, you have a very warm, compassionate delivery of how you do it. It's very engaging, and I think that's something natural. I don't think you can really teach someone that, but you do such a great job with these presentations. I really wish at these conferences, for the Bigfoot researchers, investigators listening, if you might give a speech, I would say go and copy what John's doing. Take his model, steal it, and use this as your model for when you give a presentation, because and I don't know if you can copy John, but, take a look at what he's doing as far as his presentation goes. It's very professional, very concise, and I get a lot out of him, John. I post him to the Sasquatch Chronicles all the time.
Well, thanks. I just want to say, go on. This is so effusive. No, it's very encouraging, Wes, because, I came to this, I guess it's a conclusion that, people are not reading books the way we used to. We are watching a lot more video. So I started this kind of for me, a new idea, research videos, trying to keep them short, but they still go 10 to 20 minutes. I know it's long for YouTube. And I've got them linked now to, as very, almost a major part of my website. My son is helping me, because some of them on YouTube I've actually upgraded and re-edited, and we get the kind of final version with a bit of explanation and introduction on the website under the heading research videos. And just commenting on that other point about compassion, I am compassionate with eyewitnesses and amateur investigators, because it's so hard to get a hearing. It's so hard to get eyewitness descriptions talked about in a proper context. And I have to be careful. I am trying to bring the subject into the context of an unfolding scientific discovery, which it is. So anyway, that's just a bit of background. But thanks again for the encouragement.
No, absolutely. And it's interesting, when we were at Beachfoot, I interviewed you a couple of years back. I think it was 2015. I interviewed you, and shortly after that interview, I was contacted by a very prominent professor. I won't say what university, but he's a primatologist. I'm sure if I said the university, it'd be easy to track this guy down. But his students kept coming to him, because they listen on their phone, they listen on iTunes, they listen on Stitcher, and they kept coming to him and saying, "Hey, you got to hear the show. You got to hear the show," because the show is basically. The bulk of the show is people's encounters, people saying what they've seen. And you're right, it is very hard to get people to come forward. I would say for every one witness you hear on the show, I've probably talked to 10, 15 people that don't want to come on the show, but want to tell someone their encounter. And so he started listening to it as a goof. He thought, well, this is ridiculous, but I'll entertain my students and let them know I listened to it. And the first show he listened to was actually my Beachfoot interviews. And he looked you up on Wikipedia, and he said, if Dr. Bindernagel is willing to take a look at this, maybe I should take a look at this. So he started listening to the shows. And he told me, he goes, Wes, in the scientific world, eyewitness accounts really isn't evidence, but it kind of is. I mean, you learn a lot from what eyewitnesses say, but, on the record, I'll say that's not evidence. Off the record, I'm fascinated by it. And he said, you start to see a lot of very non-human primate type behavior with the Sasquatch. And he'll email me, once every 2 months or so and say, hey, that last show you did, here's kind of a comparison with the great apes. Here's kind of a comparison with chimpanzees. Here's kind of, and so he'll give me a little bit of insight, but it's interesting because here's a professor who's a closet Bigfoot enthusiast, but he won't say it publicly. And I know you kind of went through that. I think you had more.
Still.
Yeah. Well, and forgive my language, but I think you have more balls than a lot of these scientists because you're willing to.
Thank you for that.
Well, you're willing to put your neck out there, and people don't understand that.
Well, it sounds arrogant, but it's because we're right. And I can't say that. We do have to reserve, some doubt. We're called that as scientists. Even if you feel 99.9% confident that your conclusions are correct, which I do, you do have to say, oh, yeah, are they all hoaxes? But no. And the reason I am so confident in the evidence is because of the work that you do and other amateur investigators do. They collect and they document evidence and they bring it to our attention. And I'm on side with this primatologist saying we can make sense of that. I think that's our kind of scientific obligation. We've studied primates, like non-human primates. We say, hey, this is very consistent with what we see in, like I'm doing right now, something on that short, thick neck. You look at the well-developed trapezius muscles of a gorilla. You say, oh, gee, that's the way people are drawing Sasquatches for me. It's almost a taper from the head down to right out to the shoulders. It's an anatomical explanation. So it's kind of exciting when you see things falling out to place, and you can say, hey, we can explain that. So, I really would like to get in touch with this person. I'm encouraged that he, found my take on it, worth following up, because I'm not getting that from my scientific colleagues elsewhere. But anyway,
well,
thanks.
And yeah, no, absolutely, and it's fascinating to me because there is a lot of professionals that listen to the show, but they do it in a private setting. They don't really talk about it, but I think a lot more scientists are probably interested in this than most people realize. I think, well, we can kind of go into it. I know back in 1963, you started looking into this. And for the audience out there, you have your PhD in biology from the University of Wisconsin. And, there's a mindset I don't think a lot of people realize. I hear this moan and cry all the time from the Bigfoot world that why don't scientists take us seriously? Why don't scientists? And, being a respected wildlife biologist, what really drove you to look into this topic? Because as you and I both know, that's very taboo, and it could cost you your career looking into this. What drove you to look into it?
Well, for what I want to say, I do all that moaning myself. I mean, here my big push right now is to try and get my scientific colleagues on side, and I'm talking about colleagues in the relevant scientific disciplines. Well, mammalogy, primatology, physical anthropology, and certainly my professional wildlife colleagues. But this treatment of the Sasquatch as scientifically taboo is so long-standing. It's quite difficult. So anyway, but thanks for raising that. What I keep saying to them, it's way too late for us to look proactive, but we don't have to look as if we have our heads in the sand, which is the way it's coming out. And something came up, I think it was at that same Beachwood conference you were talking about. Stan Avery from Bandon made a really good comment. He said, he talked to me, the point I made in a recent video is that eyewitnesses are puzzled by the absence of scientific participation in this discovery process. Well, they're more than puzzled. His question was, I don't understand why scientists would squander their hard-earned reputation for openness, by ignoring this evidence. So anyway, that's all background. So very briefly, it was 1963. I was a third-year student, and the actual course was wildlife management. Small class, about 13 of us, and I had at a barber shop actually seen a copy of True magazine. I know. I have to probably shouldn't even mention it was in True magazine, but it was an article by Ivan Sanderson, who's written a zoologist who's written extensively on the Sasquatch and other hominids. Anyway, and it was the William Rowe account of 1955 in central British Columbia. Really good account. And anyway, and there was an illustration there. So I raised this in class. At the end of a class, we always had a little discussion. I said, what about this ape man, that talking about in BC? And my classmates, they laugh, ha, 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 come on, John, And the professor said, oh, I'm sorry, we don't have time for that sort of thing. We need to keep studying on, reproduction and habitat choices in wolves, moose, deer, and it was just that attitude of dismissal, because I was, about 21, 22 then, I was still idealistic. I guess I'm still idealistic, but now I guess it's more like naivety, but for being so idealistic. But anyway, I thought, gee, we shouldn't be dismissing this so out of hand, should we? But, there was almost nothing available then. But by the late 60s, John Green's book started to come out. And there were these eyewitness accounts, and there was John Green being very, very, very good about his writing, very serious. So that got me going, and it led to our family moving out here to British Columbia in 1975. And But for a long time, not admitting trying not to admit my interest in this subject, because I was trying to remain employable as a professional wildlife biologist. I was doing consulting, and it's only been more recently that I would say come out of the closet, but come out more forcefully with regard to my colleagues, because I think we should be involved.
One of the things I want to ask you is, do you think there's a fear, or there's with scientists, and you can speak to this level, do you think it's more of a fear of, if I look into this, there might be something to it? Or do you think it's more of, well, I'm not going to risk my reputation on this?
Oh, for sure. And this is what forced me in that second book into this area called philosophy of science, and history and philosophy of science, which sounds dry as bones and deadly boring, but actually it's kind of exciting, because a lot of it is the scientific discoveries, and one finds that if a discovery claim is perceived as far-fetched, the discovery process gets so prolonged, and I think this is going to be a record. Like, it's been over 100 years from our early historical accounts, not even mentioning the reports from Aboriginal people and early Americans, but good published historical accounts. I'm now, back at 1841. Anyway, that's why I spend a lot of my time now in philosophy of science, trying to understand, this resistance. And that's where Leela Hadj-Cheek, the Princeton PhD, who helped me edit the book and who wrote a very, very impressive foreword for it, helped me out. And she kept directing me to people like legal scholars and archaeologists. And, some scientists they've kind of questioned scientific ideals. We really aren't as open-minded as we like to think we are, and especially if the claim is, like the Sasquatch. I mean, it's very clear. What? You're saying there's a 7-foot-tall, 600-pound upright mammal looking like a primitive human or an ape here in North America, and it's still not in Mammal Field Guides, the Peterson series, the other books? It just sounds incomprehensible. So this is what we're up against.
Do you think it would be different for scientists if, let's say, instead of Sasquatch, we plugged in a tiger, and we showed footprints from Washington State, we showed footprints from British Columbia, we showed footprints from Ontario, we showed footprints from, and we had eyewitness reports of seeing this tiger? Do you think it's because it's more on the primate side that they're unwilling, or do you think it's irrelevant that they probably wouldn't look into a tiger either?
Yeah. No, I totally agree. I mean, the thing is, you bring in a bit cat like that. Well, at least we've got, cougars, mountain lions. We got bobcats, So, I mean, at least the group is represented here, as far as primates, I mean, we're it. We humans are considered to be it for North America. So here we are saying, actually, there's another primate here, non-human. Well, I'm saying non-human primate, but in that group, Hominoidea, more broadly the primates, we're saying, no, there's another primate here. It's living alongside of it. Well, that's part of the problem of that claim being perceived as far-fetched. And there again, there's a wonderful area in philosophy of science called prematurity in scientific discovery. And very briefly, a discovery is considered premature if there aren't a lot of links and steps leading up to it in generally available knowledge. Well, you see, in 1958, there was Jerry Crew with a Bigfoot cast suddenly, and in 1967, the Patterson-Gimlin film, equally suddenly, and you know, then the media is saying, well, there's no background for this. Well, that's why the historical accounts are actually very, very important, saying, oh, no, first there were these reports of a monster, and then that so-called monster becomes better described, and you get people back in the 1800s saying, you know, it looked like a gorilla and like nothing else. That's an Oregon report from the Sixes River. And so, you know, I've got those in the book, and I'm working on another video now to show this isn't actually a premature discovery. If we were paying attention, and I don't want to fault anyone, but those reports languished. Well, you might say, and for good reason. They didn't fit, you know. Anyway, but there was a lot of stuff leading up to Jerry Crew in that first Bigfoot, well, the first track, and leading to the unfortunate name Bigfoot, and then to the Patterson-Gimlin film. And of course, as we all know, and continuing.
And you're right. There is a long historical accounts. You know, people would call it the monster. They would call it the wild man. They would call it the grass man. They would call it the chicken man. And so, you know, all around, there's always been this legend of this thing around. And it wasn't until recently people start calling it, yeah, I'm with you on the Bigfoot thing. I'd rather call it Sasquatch. But, you know, and it fits basically historical accounts have been going on for 100 plus years or more or longer. Yeah. I wanted to ask you about your own sighting, and I've never talked to you about your own personal sighting. And as I was telling you, the audience, this show is mainly about people's sightings. There's a lot more I want to get to beyond the sighting, but I wanted to ask you about your sighting. What were you out doing? And then for the audience, what did you see?
Well, it wasn't a great sighting, and that's why I don't talk about it. I find the other evidence, like the track photographs and track casts, and even eyewitness descriptions and drawings, more compelling. But yeah, anyway, it was about 2007. Adrian Erickson had been sponsoring a project in Kentucky, invited me there, saying, John, if you stayed for a week, I think you might see this. There's some kind of semi-habituated Sasquatches on this piece of land. Dennis Foll is there, Leela Hadj-Cheek is there, scientific advisor. So I did spend pretty much a week, and around the middle of the week, they said, oh, you should come out. There seems to be one standing in a fence row, you know, kind of looking out over the field to seeing what's going on. So we went out, and we could see from the house, actually, out the window, yeah, there was some upright creature in the fence. When I say creature, because it was gently rocking side to side. It was pretty obscured by vegetation, but I could see a shoulder and what appeared to be a head, and there was this rocking motion. And then the woman there who'd been habituating them by feeding them, she went out with some pancakes and, you know, spoke in the high-pitched voice, which seemed to reassure Sasquatches in the past, and they thought it might emerge. Well, it didn't. It kind of got spooked, actually, and turned and walked into the forest. But as it turned and walked, the big arm came up, swinging backwards as it kind of took off. So that was probably the best part of it for me. But I mean, I was going to say there's better stuff on these YouTube clips, but of course you need to have the backstory, and there's always this fear with, I mean, some very convincing YouTube clips, but you know, as soon as and I understand why a scientist might want to come forward and say, gee, that looks pretty interesting, and then someone's going to say, gotcha, that was my brother-in-law, da-da-da-da. You know, so we do need more complete, well, what we come to call the backstory for these things, and to know who saw what they were doing, and what were the circumstances. But anyway, that's my
I wanted to ask you, because that was a great sighting. But you know, there's that's a famous case out there in Kentucky, and I wanted to ask you, as a wildlife biologist, because I always tell people don't feed these things, and you know, I don't have the credentials to really say one way or another. I can just tell you what seems common sense to me is not to feed them. And it seems like there's a lot of bad stories when people stop feeding these things around their property. And I've had a lot of witnesses on that have been feeding them, and then all of a sudden they stop and things go bad really quick. It seems to anger the Sasquatch. They seem to have very short tempers. But as a wildlife biologist, would you recommend that someone feed these things if they see them around their property?
Well, actually, feeding of any wildlife, of course, is not encouraged. But I mean, to me, this is kind of a special situation where I think habituation is the well. I mean, Jane Goodall was actually criticized for this, for feeding chimpanzees to kind of encourage them to hang around the camp for more observations, and it worked out. But that was controversial. I think it's a tool, and I think I mean, we're stuck in limbo here. You know, poor Grover Krantz, he suggested a lot of people say we're not going to get anywhere without a type specimen. Grover suggested collecting a type specimen was strongly criticized. It meant basically shooting one. His point was, once we have one, we'll then get protection for all the rest of the population. But that wasn't good enough. Okay, we're getting good video clips, you know, and people are saying hoax, still saying hoax. We're getting some really good track casts, whereas people are understanding the need to document casts. And I've been trying to actually acquire some of these now, and I have been doing so. So I still think tracks pretty good evidence. But anyway, habituation does provide an opportunity for good filming, for sound recording, for recording tracks, for observation, either from a blind and, you know, the various trail cams and other cams and just cams and monitors. You know, so with the technology, you know, is widely available and coming down in price. If someone would do this in kind of a disciplined manner, you know, I mean, you know, maybe putting out foods that are somewhat natural for the Sasquatch, and because I think it's quite possible to develop, I don't know if you'd call it rapport, but I mean, these are primates. They are not unintelligent. They're very intelligent, and I think they would respond to what would be a positive overture, such as supplying food.
Well, I wanted to ask you, you know, being a wildlife biologist, I know when you do, I believe it's called a wildlife survey, as you mentioned, the tracks are very important. And as you look at one of the things, it was that professor that actually brought it to my attention, and it was right in front of my face the whole time. I don't know why it never crossed my mind. But if you listen to people's descriptions of Sasquatch, I can tell you from interviewing so many witnesses, there seems to be different types. Like here in the Pacific Northwest, where we're at, John, people will describe more of an ape-type creature. If you start to go down south in the southwest of the United States, a lot of times people will say it looked very chimp-like in the face. It looked very chimp-like in the face. Had some human features, but it looked very chimp-like. And then in some areas, people will say, well, it looked more human-like in the face. But if you look at the track casts, and maybe I'm off on this, but if you look at the track casts, they look very human, just on a larger scale.
Oh, yes.
But the descriptions of what people describe seem to be more of a non-human primate. And I realize this is kind of a open-ended question, but if, in your professional opinion, what do you think Sasquatch is?
Well, I've had to back off, you know, because I was quite convinced. John Green thought it was an ape. Grover Krantz thought it was an ape. In my first book, the title was The Sasquatch, North America's Great Ape. John Green said, oh, great title. I wish I'd thought of that. But I backed off because that turned out to be quite divisive, just what you're describing. There's a lot of investigators, serious investigators, say, no way is this an ape. This is definitely human. Well, I've got a research video I'm working on because the great ape hypothesis is quite helpful. You know, it explains just a lot of the physical anatomical features of the Sasquatch, but some people find that quite offensive, and this is kind of a cultural thing. Now, physical anthropologists, that's why it'd be good to get them on side because they And so I have to be careful here. But from an anatomical point of view, there is kind of a gradation, you know. You got an upright great ape and an upright human. We got these prominent shoulders, you know. Now, the great apes tend not to walk bipedally, not habitually. And yes, their great toe tends to diverge, unlike the human great toe and the Sasquatch great toe, which tend to be lined up with the others. So it does share anatomical attributes, physical attributes of both apes and humans. And this is problematic, because then you got people saying, "Oh, missing link." Well, gee, you sort of don't want to use provocative language like that, because first of all, it brings up Piltdown Man, which was a huge embarrassment in physical anthropology for about 40 years, when it looked like the missing link had been discovered and turned out to be a hoax. So it's tricky, and you know, I'm doing. And maybe it's kind of what you were describing earlier. I'm trying to say, okay, let's just take this evidence, take a very conservative interpretation. Let's try not to jump to conclusions and try to just look at it in terms of other mammals. And see, to me, it seemed easier to propose an upright great ape in North America than some kind of human. But that's met with resistance. So I don't know.
Yeah, and again, there's no wrong answer, because like I always say, no one has one in their garage they're studying.
Well, not yet. That's right.
You know, there's really no wrong answer. You know, do you think that one thing I find frustrating is, you know, I can bring you, and I realize, and forgive me, I'm not a scientist and I'm not a professional, but I can bring you all the eyewitness testimony you want, and you can look across the board and see it's consistent. And it's people from all walks of life. I mean, from judges to police officers to hunters to hikers to house moms. And yet they all say for the most part, I mean, there's some differences, but for the most part, they're describing the same thing. And then we have these track casts. And I've had a lot of people, professionals, look at the track cast and go, yeah, that was made by something living. That wasn't like a cutout of a wooden foot. That was actually a living creature that made that track cast. And then, you know, we can look at the audio. And audio is a little bit better than video. I know in this day and age we live in, people want the quick, they want the Patterson-Gimlin film over and over and over again. I don't think you're going to get that, but that's what people want. But the interesting part is when you look at audio, it's very tricky to hoax audio because you can put it in a spectrograph and go, well, that's not coyotes, that's not a bear, and that sounds very primate-like. And so you have all of this evidence, yet again, science, it's not a subject that's taken very seriously. I think it's, as we go in small pieces, it's starting to be taken more and more seriously. But do you think that we need a type specimen?
I don't. When you say we, my colleagues seem to. And see, this is, I don't know if I should call it a complaint. It's an observation I've made. And something I realized, writing books has been helpful to me. Scientists are kind of split. Scientists, they need a theoretical base for something, and basically what they have said, unless you can propose a theory for the existence of this creature here in North America, I see no need to look at all that evidence you're bringing forward, because it's probably bogus. And I say, oh, gee, but, you know, and this is what we get from philosophy of science. No, sometimes the evidence is leading in a certain direction. We do not have a theory to explain it yet. And the point of some physicists is, you know, follow the evidence where it goes, and the theory will eventually arise. And so that's what I think is happening. But I'm glad you mentioned audio, because this is the vocalization is the most recent form of evidence that I've started working on. It's kind of tough because I'm half deaf from too much shooting in my younger years, but we're getting some really good stuff here in British Columbia from a remote island. It's comparable with some stuff from Manitoba in central Canada. Actually, one of the research videos addresses it. But the problem, you know, people are starting to do a really good job of documenting this now. Of course, down there, you know, in Washington, these people like David Ellis and Paul Graves are doing really good stuff. Anyway, so my point is, now we've got to get the relevant bioacoustic specialist to consider this, you know. But they're put off by all the adulterations of the evidence, hoax claims, and some actual hoaxes, and they don't want to get involved either. So there's this barrier that's what I'm struggling with.
Yeah, and it's, I grow impatient. I haven't been looking into this by any means as long as you have, and I don't understand how you've kept your patience over the years, but it gets frustrating.
I haven't.
But it gets frustrating, It's like, okay, you won't look at this, you won't look at this, you won't. And so in my mind, I tend to agree with Grover Krantz. I know the audience hates me when I say this. One has to be killed and brought in. It's just the way it is. I hate to break it to everyone, but that's the way I feel, because they won't look at the audio. They won't look at the track cast. Eyewitness testimony is irrelevant in most, on the record for most scientists, even though I think a lot of them listen to the show and take that as a form of evidence. But they won't look at any of this stuff. Put videos aside and just look at some of this other stuff. And I usually tell people, if you don't believe into this, that's okay. If you're skeptical, I love skeptics. Take 6 months.
Exactly.
And look into this, and then tell me that there's nothing to this. After you, give it a good shot. Take 6 months and look into it. But the problem is I don't think it's going to be proven with DNA. I don't think it's going to be proven with video. I don't think it's going to be proven with audio. Track casts, eyewitness testimony. You can go down the list. I think Grover Krantz was right. I think one probably has to be shot and brought in. Now that's a big task. It's a very dangerous task, but I think that's probably what needs to be done.
Maybe, yeah. No, I don't know. But you made a couple good points. First of all, I sense the frustration in your voice that I feel, and I say this is part of the problem. We know too much. We've been doing this too long. I envy you the exposure you have to eyewitness descriptions. I mean, wow, that I'd like to hear more of that. But again, philosophy of science, eyewitness descriptions. Who is this? Michael Polanyi. Saying, a chemist, and he's saying, some of this evidence, it points us in a certain direction. It's not necessarily conclusive. Our colleagues may not consider it evidence, but it points us in a direction, and we need to, it may be worthwhile following it. And so that's a more modest take on eyewitness description, because, there is a lot of resistance to that, and for good reason.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, one of the questions that was asked to me a couple of years back, and I didn't have a great answer for it. I was kind of stopped dead in my tracks. A guy, Gary Wayne, he wrote a book, Genesis 6. It's about the Nephilim and all this other stuff. Well, he has an interest in Sasquatch. And he said to me, Wes, don't you find it interesting and fascinating that Sasquatch is reported on almost every continent? It's in Canada, it's in it's in China, it's in Russia, it's in the United States, it's reported in Australia, and everyone kind of has a different name for it. Yet there's not. He goes, don't you find it weird that really there's not a whole? We haven't really moved the subject forward. I mean, there's really not a whole lot's changed since the Patterson-Gimlin film. I mean, really nothing's changed. Yet it's reported everywhere, and I didn't have an answer for him.
Well, I have a couple of comments on that, if I may, because, the scientific discipline that first started studying the Sasquatch was cultural anthropologists. Now, these were not physical anthropologists studying apes and primates and humans. They were looking into like Aboriginal culture, and they said, yes, this imaginary giant that we keep hearing about, I think that's a metaphor for wilderness and fear and famine, and certainly Aboriginal people in northern Canada. It's a very widespread motif in Aboriginal culture, and this is what it is, and this is this metaphor, this representation of something, and that became very widely accepted. But anyway, and we didn't actually weren't able to attract other anthropologists. I had something else I was going to say, but anyway, there's that problem. Oh, and another thing, so this is the other thing. They say, and proof that it's simply a metaphor or an imaginary being is that it occurs all around the world. Australia has one, Indonesia has one, China has one. This is the problem with these other hominids. But as you know, Jeff Meldrum is working ahead on that, and Cliff Barrickman has done some great work with the orang pendek in Sumatra, and he's working with an Indonesian fellow there. They're collaborating and getting great track casts of the orang pendek. And I'm thinking, oh, shucks, they're going to have a better acceptance of the orang pendek, that kind of small ape, I think it's an ape, an upright ape, of Sumatra, than we have for the North American Sasquatch. And Grover had a good comment. He said, oh, we really should be working on the Sasquatch because we just have so much. Well, then, when Grover was talking, he died in, I think, the year 2000. But by then, he said we have so much for the Sasquatch, and now we have even more. And I agree with you. We should be much further ahead than we are. Sorry.
No.
This always turns into a bit of a rant these days.
No, I love it. You're doing great. I love it. Please don't cut yourself off. You're doing great. I wanted to ask you, you went to Russia to look into the Almas. What were some of the differences and similarities that you found when you were in Russia compared to what we have here in the United States or in Canada? Was there differences and was there similarities as far as what the Russians say about the Almasty?
Well, mainly similarities. Well, actually, and Jeff Meldum's picked up on this because he's continuing to collaborate with an investigator there. There may, in fact, be two. You've talked about some of the differences here in North America, at least anatomical differences. There is, the Almas of the Caucasus region, which sound quite human-like, and then there's the traditional, what they call the snowman, the Western snowman, which is very much like our large North American Sasquatch. So there may be two, and people, as Jeff commented, they conflate them and they mix them, but gee, there's some good stuff. I kind of got, for that trip, I got into the Dmitry Bayanov's writing. And some of the stuff in the remote areas of the eastern Russia and the Arctic, quite amazing. Don't leave if you've been hunting and you get a carcass, don't leave it out, because if you leave it out overnight, it'll be gone by morning, and they knew who was taking it. And just matter of fact, it's kind of like the Aboriginal situation. Very matter here in North America with some groups, very matter of fact. We know that this mammal is out there. Yeah, basically friendly, but there's certain things we shouldn't do, and things get taken. Fish from smokehouses, smoked salmon, that sort of thing, and that's widely known. Got one more comment on Russia. One of the best forms of evidence was these twisted saplings, and we're getting that here in North America, but not as well illustrated as there. But you can't really bring in Sasquatch evidence from Russia to explain North American evidence, because we don't even accept it here. So it puts us in kind of limbo. Anyways, yeah.
Yeah, did you have any aggressive reports? I mean, as you talked to eyewitnesses or as you researched the area, investigated the area, was there any aggressive reports?
Moderate. Well, there is that historical Bauman story that I actually wrote it up in the first book. But if we follow that story, this is where a trapper, he was killed. I'm trying to remember where his head. It's old, from the 1800s. Theodore Roosevelt wrote it up. But if you read that whole story, these trappers were in an area, and there had been several acts of intimidation where, if it was a Sasquatch, something had come and trashed their lean-to on 2 occasions. It had left tracks. And they had said, gee, that bear is walking on 2 feet. So, I mean, it was around, and it was showing that it was not happy with the presence of these trappers. They finally said, we should get out of here. And when they were picking up tracks, one of them was killed. And that's really the only sort of published case of strong aggression that I know of.
And the other thing I want to ask you is this different types. As I talked to eyewitnesses, as I was mentioning earlier, here in the Pacific Northwest, they seem to be a lot bigger. They seem to be more, a cross between Arnold Schwarzenegger and an ape in size. And what's interesting is and a lot of times when people see them in the face, they'll say it looked very ape-like, except for the nose. Everyone says it had a human nose.
Yeah.
But as you go down,
The nose is controversial. Sorry.
It is. It is very controversial. And as you go down south, the reports, they aren't as big. Like in Texas and Arkansas and Oklahoma, the reports, they generally aren't as big. I mean, sometimes they are, but I would say for the most part, people report things being 7, maybe 8 feet tall at the very max. Generally speaking, I mean. And they'll say, when they see it, they'll say it looked like a chimp, except for it had a human type nose, but it looked very chimp-like in the face. And then as you go kind of on the eastern seaboard, I get a lot of reports of people saying, well, no, it actually looked very human-like. It looked kind of, and forgive me for this, but it kind of looked, Native Americans have certain features. They have the high cheekbones, and they'll say it kind of looked like that. It wasn't quite human, but it was more like that. And as I started interviewing these eyewitnesses, at first I had a hard time with that. I was like, well, that's not what we're seeing. I mean, that's not, that's you guys must be seeing something else. And then it kind of hit me one day. It makes sense that they wouldn't be, you get down to like Texas and Arkansas and Oklahoma, and the land and the food and the water and everything isn't in comparison to what we have here in the Pacific Northwest. There's a lot of room to run around. And so, these different types have come up. And as a wildlife biologist, what is your take on that when you hear of these different...
Well, you see, this is the thing. As a wildlife biologist, we're looking at, say a deer or a bear or an elk. And you go to Field Guide to the Mammals, one image of a white-tailed deer describes the white-tailed deer. One image of a black bear, they all pretty much look like that. Now, in primates, you get all this variation. It's called polymorphism, different shapes. I mean, look at we humans, from tall and gangly thin to short and wide, and different hair color, very different physical features. And I'm sure that's going on. Well, it does go on in chimpanzees because, I mean, Jane Goodall, she could identify individual chimps easily by various physical features and hair color and stuff like that. So I think that's going on. So I think there definitely is quite a bit of variation. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it kind of made sense to me that there would be variation. If everyone was describing the exact same thing everyone's seeing in Washington State or British Columbia, if you really think about it, it doesn't really make sense because it's a different environment, and you get down to Texas or Florida, and it's a completely different environment than what we have here in the Pacific Northwest where you and I are at, John. And it would make sense that you would kind of get a variation of different types. If no one knew what a primate was, a non-human primate, and one person saw a gorilla and one person saw a chimp, their descriptions wouldn't match up. I mean, they would kind of match up, but there would be subtle differences between a chimp and a gorilla. And that's kind of when I started looking at these different types, it kind of made sense that there would be.
Go ahead. Well, you see, this is the thing, and we are progressing. We're getting anatomical details, and after I'm working on doing this field guide entry right now, and eventually I'm going to get up to the Sasquatch face, and there are people that are eyewitnesses who describe. Sure, the face is flat compared to a bear. It doesn't have the big snout, so we can eliminate bears. In the human-like thing, sometimes the nose seems prominent, sometimes the nose is very flat. A couple of reports talk about prognathism, and this is when the jaw area kind of protrudes, which is very chimp-like, very ape-like, and not human-like, at least not in modern humans. But, it's being reported, so, okay, it's at least explainable anatomically.
I wanted to ask you, what's the most intriguing report that you ever received from an eyewitness? What's one that kind of sticks with you?
Unfortunately, it's secondhand, and some people, they don't want to talk it. Anyway, okay, so how does it go? It's on the BC mainland. A guy's up in the mountains. He sees a Sasquatch, and what's going on, according to his description, is that it's ripping open a log, pulling out ants, maybe other insects, grubs and things, from the log, throwing them into a creek, which is a trout stream. Trout are rising for this arrival of the food, and it starts scooping out trout onto the bank as food for itself. Well, that's a heck of a story. I mean, I'm very interested in food habits because there's a lot of criticism saying, how can a 700-pound mammal support itself in these coniferous forests? Well, see, here's intelligence and learning at work if it's true. But, I haven't been able to follow that one up. I'd like to, sit down with the eyewitness, get the backstory, get a sense of that person's experience and reliability as an eyewitness. But these are intriguing, and this goes back to the comment of Polanyi. Things like that point the way. They kind of give us a suggestion of how the Sasquatch is not just, surviving in the forest here and elsewhere, but possibly even thriving, as Aboriginal people, of course, have done on this coast for thousands of years. Well, that's the whole shellfish thing out here, but anyway.
Yeah, and you hear a lot of primates do that. There's one report I'll send you. I did a whole show on it of this hunter who saw one, and he was in the forest, and at first he thought it was a bear, and then it just didn't make sense what he was seeing, and he was looking at it the whole time through his scope. And what this creature did, he said, Wes, I thought it was an ape. I thought it was a monkey. He goes, but the face looked very human-like. But he wasn't really, he was far enough away, and the creature hadn't seen him. And he said when it came out of the forest, and I thought this was a very fascinating report, he said when it came out of the forest, it started sniffing the air. And he said it was sniffing the air, and it kind of looked around real cautiously. And he was in a blind, so it didn't see him. He's quite a distance away. So he's watching this thing, and he goes, I think this thing had been shot. And I said, why do you say that? And he goes, well, he goes, my I can't remember if it was his father or his uncle had a stroke, and one side of his body he basically couldn't use. And he said this thing, the left arm was just kind of hanging down, and it wasn't using it. And he said it picked up a rock, and it started tapping on a tree, and it sounded like a wood knock. And then it put its ear up against a tree, and it tapped a couple more times, put its ear up against a tree, and then it knocked the tree over and grabbed a rodent, smashed it up against another tree, ripped it open, and started eating it right there. And he said when it got done, it stood up and it walked back into the tree line. And he had a great description of this creature, but it was the first time I'd ever heard a Sasquatch doing that. I mean, that's a very intelligent thing. And you hear a lot of this, other things. People talk about these wood knocks. Well, I've had witnesses on the show that have seen them slap a tree with their hand, open fist or open palm, hit a tree, and the hunter that saw it said it sounded just like a wood knock, but it was open hand hitting a tree, and it hit the tree so hard it echoed. And so there's a lot of things you can get from eyewitnesses, like the report you were just talking about.
For sure. I wonder, you probably, we're all familiar with it. You mentioned that rodent. That's a really interesting report, because it goes the Glenn Thomas report from Oregon, where Glenn Thomas walked across a rock slide. Where Glenn Thomas saw 3 Sasquatches walking across a rock slide, and the adults were picking up rocks and sniffing them. Finally smelt something that must have been interesting, because the male dug a big well-like pit and started pulling up hibernating ground squirrels and bedding, and they started eating them. I mean, that is just so similar to the situation that you just described. So,
yeah,
a lot of this, I think, you take that for what it's worth, and you kind of put it on the shelf. Say, okay, it's there. It may or may not be published. It may just be recorded like yours is, audio, and that's great. But it sits there. And like for me, when you tell me that one you just told me about the rodent and the squirrel, presumably in the tree, it's maybe not corroboration, but it's kind of building on this form. It's almost like foraging rather than needing predation, where a Sasquatch has to kind of run down something or use ambush predation. Foraging is so much easier. It's like the scooping of a shellfish on a beach, and like the case of the hibernating ground squirrels in Oregon. Just scooping them out and when they're in hibernation. And maybe this thing in the squirrel in the tree was almost like foraging. Just had to reach in and grab it. I don't know, but But that's great. Gee,
Well,
thanks, Wes.
I had a hunter one time in Texas tell me that is actually common. You can do that as a hunter. You can actually, if you tap in a tree, especially like a deadfall tree, or if you tap on it, you can listen. And a lot of times you can grab. I'm not into eating rodents, but some people that's what they do. But he was telling me that is actually some hunters do that. And, you learn so much from eyewitnesses. A lot of times you hear of old reports of them picking berries. And I even get those today. But I had a law enforcement officer, and this guy was in tears the whole time he's telling me the story. He was up in a tree stand. And what he saw, he didn't believe in Sasquatch. He thought it was nonsense. But he's in this tree stand. And he said that what he saw is this hog come running out of the brush, a very large hog. And then he goes, Wes, there was two very large chimpanzees, and they grabbed this hog, smashed it. They broke its neck, smashed it against a tree. They ripped it open. He's watching all this from a tree stand, and he said they sat down and ate it right there. And I had him describe these quote unquote chimpanzees he was talking about, and he said, they're about 8 feet tall. And he's basically describing a Sasquatch. He's describing their face and everything. But I thought that was fascinating. Here they run down a hog.
It is fascinating.
And they smash it and then eat it. It makes sense.
Yeah. Well, going back to my early years, trying to get started, wondering if I should get started in Sasquatch research. I was working for the United Nations in Serengeti National Park at a research institute, and we'd sit around in the evening and talk about other wildlife stuff. And I started talking about the North American Sasquatch. I said, when I go back, this was, 70. Anyway, when I go back, I'm planning to move to BC and study it there. Any ideas? So we had this international group, Europeans and Americans, and saying, well, John, if I were you going back, I'd concentrate on food habits, because that's obviously critical and a key to understanding, well, first of all, its ecological viability, and might give you some leads on where to find it. So that's why I get quite excited about food habits reports, because I don't have a lot. Well, I do. I have about 49 items of food listed in the first book, and these are food items. Either a Sasquatch was observed eating it or carrying it, presumably to eat later. But you just keep adding to it. That's great. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you. I've talked to wildlife biologists that work for the state here in Washington, one in Washington and one in Oregon, and I've talked to a lot of DNR officers. There's Dr. Briggs Hall. He was a
I know him. Yeah.
DNR officer. And if you start talking to these guys, it becomes very evident that there's some sort of cover up going on, at least in my mind, because they're told, okay, don't go into these areas. There's one in Oregon. A lady had contacted me, and she said, they were told not to go into a particular area, and they started asking why. And what they were told was, well, there's a bear in the area. And she goes, Wes, we run into bears all the time. But she goes, there is kind of a hidden agenda when it comes to Sasquatch. It's not to be talked about. Any reports or, anything's kind of brushed under the carpet. But I wanted to ask you your own professional opinion. Do you think that it's being covered up?
Well, I try to be very careful, because as soon as you mention covering up or suppression of evidence, it starts sounding like conspiracy theory, and I really do not want to go there, because there is enough of that around. There's enough bizarre explanations for the Sasquatch that really I don't like to see brought forward, because it invalidates our research. Now, having said that, again, philosophy of science shows me that there is such strong resistance to a claim that's far-fetched that, what's it called, cognitive dissonance. It's much easier and safer to just put this thing aside. I guess it goes back to the earlier comments. When we get our type specimen, then and only then will it become an option. And that's why I'm working so hard right now on my field guide entry, because it goes back to this problem. You see, all these people were taught, they see a Sasquatch. Now, in the old days, people like me, we'd come home and look it up in Mammals of North America, the field guide. It's not there. Closest thing is an upright bear. Well, some would say, could be, but not good. Others would say, absolutely no way. But we're not given that option. And that's it's disappointing and discouraging, and at some point, I think we're going to be accused of professional irresponsibility for not having got to this point yet. But anyway, so I think I got off track.
No, you're fine, and I respect your opinion on it. I respect, it's kind of a fine line you have to walk sometimes because it's so hard to prove. A lot of times those people, and again, it's a wildlife biologist and they don't want to come on the show for obvious reasons. And so it's kind of a fine line you have to walk. I want to ask you, you talk about the...
Excuse me, I'd like to comment on that because this is what I'm working on now. I'm saying to my colleagues, they're trying to save their reputation by avoiding the subject. When they're younger, they could enhance their reputation by engaging the subject. They will look prescient, They will look, hey, here's a guy. He was ahead of his time. He actually was open-minded to these claims. And that's where I am. I'm pretty late in my career here, and I'm actually... as I said earlier, it's too late for most of us, for people to look, professionals to look proactive, but we really don't have to look as bad as we do. And I think it's so safe, It shouldn't be seen as such a big deal to talk about. You don't have to admit that you have conclusively accepted the existence of the Sasquatch. But can we not just discuss the evidence and... Yeah. Anyway, sorry. I just wanted
No,
to
you're right. You're right, and that's I think for the most part, all of us who are involved in this subject, I really think that's what we want. And I say we, the non-scientists, the non-professionals. You don't have to accept it as being true, but just take a look at the evidence. Maybe listen to a couple eyewitnesses. The professor I told you about. I know he listens all the time. He'll probably listen to this show and email me afterwards, but I know he listens all the time, and he is focused on, and he's told me, he said, Wes, on the record, I'll tell you that eyewitness testimony is irrelevant. Off the record, I find it fascinating. And he'll discuss it with his students. And that's a huge step forward because, and I get it. I completely get it. If I was a scientist, I don't know if I would have the balls like you, like Dr. Meldrum, some of these other guys to come forward and say, hey, I'm looking into this. And that takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of courage for a witness to come forward, let alone ruin your whole
Yes, it does. Yes, it does.
Professional career, and say you're looking into this. I just wish more, like you said, there's nothing wrong with discussing it. Why not discuss it? You don't have to admit it's true. Why not discuss it? Discuss the evidence.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I get, there's certain things that sort of drive me forward and keep me going. And one is saying, and when people have a report and they'll tell me maybe in confidence, I say, gee, hang on to that. I know you can't really dine out on that report right now, but you will down the road, and it's trying to give them confidence. And it so distresses me. This is valuable scientific information that people are trying to report, and my biologist colleagues are kind of maybe not rebuffing them, but they're not taking them seriously. They're not filing these reports. They're being, well, I don't want to use the word closed-minded, but they're being very resistant to engaging this, which is, again, it comes down at some point to professional irresponsibility. Surely we should be at least making notes. Anyway, it's becoming more of an issue with me all the time.
Yeah, and is this what you would call, you talk about the discovery of Sasquatch, and I've watched your videos, and you talk about it being a prolonged process. Is that kind of what we're in right now? We're in this long, prolonged process as far as...
We are, and some of us are running out of time and would like to see it move a little faster. Well, but not just for people like me, but for the eyewitnesses themselves. There's some real distress that I've heard about. People have gone for counseling because they've seen something that's not supposed to exist. And I know in one case, the counselors, I once asked him, so have you ever had a client or a patient come to you with a Sasquatch report for counseling? He said, yes, and because they've seen a Sasquatch. Oh, yes, people have come to me because they thought they saw a Sasquatch. Well, you see, that was his attitude, that they thought they saw a Sasquatch. The person didn't think. He or she knew, you see. And so they're not getting maybe the counseling they needed. So we're stuck in this situation of, well, just that it's still invalid.
Yeah, and you're right. You know, I have talked to a lot of, and I hate to say this, but I've talked to a lot of alcoholics off the air, and we never mention any of that stuff on the air, but people see these things and it affects them. You know, it's kind of like finding out the boogeyman's real. I know that's a bad example, but, you know, it's like seeing a unicorn.
Yeah.
It's not supposed to exist, and they see it, and I think it shocks us as humans to see something that's kind of close to us that really is myth and legend and should not exist. And you'd be surprised. You talk to a lot of these hunters and stuff, and I've talked to a lot of them where that was the last day they went hunting. They've been lifelong hunters. They see this thing, and then that's it. They're done. They never go in the forest again. And it's kind of a shame because who do you talk to?
Well, that's a really good point, and I think it explains both you and I seem to say almost like a sense of mission here, you know. And I think that's what I see as part of my responsibility, hopefully without sounding too self-righteous, but to create an atmosphere, as you do, where it's safe to talk about this. You know, it's okay to have seen a Sasquatch, and not only is it okay, it's a good thing. And thank you for sharing the report. We need to get to that, because I don't know if I'll be around or not for that day when, you know, we get acceptance, whether it's the type specimen or whatever gets us over the tipping point. And as you know, probably better than I, there are so many reports out there in people's heads, and just awaiting a safe environment to bring them forward, which they really want to do. It's sometimes quite a cathartic experience for them, and I found this out, to talk to someone who's a willing listener.
Yeah, you're right. And I think that's what most people want. You know, they want someone. My situation's different because I've had an encounter. So when people will come to me, I understand how they feel. I understand what they've gone through. And I understand the other side of the coin when I talk to hunters who say, hey, listen, I've been out hunting my whole life. I've never seen anything close to a Sasquatch. I get it. I completely get it, because I was there at one time being the hunter, and I was never looking for evidence. I was focused on getting an elk, but that was my focus when I was out in the woods. But that's neither here nor there. But I get it. I completely get it when people are skeptical of this subject.
And that's the great thing. Someone like you, and I know Todd Neese is another one, you know, they have a sighting, and at some point they become investigators. And that's why you're doing such a great job of archiving this stuff. I've really got to catch up on what you've got in your audio files. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. One question I want to ask you, John, and I realize a lot of these questions is more or less theory. It's not really black or white. But in a lot of these reports, well, I won't say a lot of these reports, very few reports, but I do get them, of people reporting the smell. Not always. I would say in most encounters, people will say, I smelled nothing. But you do get these reports of, especially hunters, where they will talk about walking into a wall of just foul, just a terrible smell. Do you have any theory on that as far as why?
Yeah, I do. And you made a very good point, because, you know, in John Green's files, when I was studying them, only, I think, around 16% was there, that strong odor. But when it occurred, it was just overwhelming. Your description as a wall of odor or scent is pretty good. I mean, you know, I've heard description like, you know, the smell of 20 skunks spraying, something like that, gagging, you know. Well, you know, again, if it's not offensive to relate to the great apes, Diane Fossey described the gagging fear odor of a female Sasquatch who was being stressed or chased or felt threatened for some reason. And it comes out. Like, we humans have it to some extent, but the great apes seem to have it more strongly, and it is the scent glands, it is the armpits, much more highly developed apparently in gorillas. So yeah, I think it's real. I equate it to a sense of stress. and which again is sort of like humans. The smell of fear, that sort of thing. Because, you get these reports, and I know it from some clam diggers here on the BC coast, some guys out at night, and suddenly they're digging clams, it's dark, there's this smell, and they say, oh, there's a dead seal here, it's really rotting, but then it goes away. So, no, it wasn't a dead seal, because it would have persisted. And so they say, oh, yeah, they would say it's Bukwas, the Sasquatch. So, yeah, I think the odor is important. We just have to, kind of try to understand it.
Yeah, and you're right. You do hear of great apes doing that. I mean, we as humans do that when we get to a smaller extent to what people are describing. But even great apes have that. They let that scent gland off. And usually when they're under stress or fear or emotions are involved, it seems to get this smell. And it's interesting because usually hunters they'll have a rock thrown at them. I had a hunter one time on the show. He had a rock thrown at him, and he thought it was another hunter messing with him. So he got down out of his tree stand, started screaming and yelling and walking to where this rock was thrown at him because he thought it was a person. And he said he just walked into this wall of the most foul odor he's ever smelled in his life, and he had a small glimpse of it run off. But I found that fascinating because here's a guy who doesn't believe in Bigfoot, but he charges it thinking it's a hunter screwing with him, and then he walks into this wall of stink. It probably wasn't expecting that type of reaction, and that's kind of how I equate the smell. But again, it's all theory,
No, that's good. No, it's more than theory. But it's a couple of there's evidence and then there's interpretation, and the evidence, a rock was thrown. Well, it's maybe testimonial evidence. Anyway, and that from that direction there was the strong smell. Okay, but these things can just stand there. That's the sort of thing. Then you have made a point. Maybe it's speculation and theory that these two things are related, and they're related to the Sasquatch. But we just keep, these are the building blocks of discovery. You keep putting that together often enough, and you say, okay, we're getting some consistency here. And this comes back to my concern that there's not enough of this. It's happening, but it's not being talked about or reported to, the people that I think should be dealing with it, who have much more knowledge than I have, for interpreting this and putting it in perspective, making sense of it.
Yeah, no, I agree. As a wildlife biologist, if someone went to you and said, John, go find these things, how would you go about tracking these things down?
Well, people do come to me saying, I'm coming to Vancouver Island, or I'm coming to BC. I'm interested in, studying the Sasquatch. Where would I go? And I think, oh, gee, I've got this list of, they're good areas, but they're still not pinpointing things. I'm just like everybody else. I'm looking for repeat sightings in an area, hopefully maybe the same time of year. And you get that, say, on clam beaches or berry patches or salmon streams. But we're still talking large areas, and I've got trail cameras out, and I'm following up on stuff. And this is we don't have that level of predictability that we do have, with deer, elk, bears. We can be, hunters have got it figured out. Well, I know where there's a big buck, and we're not picking them up on trail cams, for maybe a number of reasons. But I wish John Green was so heartened when I arrived in BC in '75 as a wildlife biologist. I said, well, don't count on me too much. It's quite a big problem we have in front of us here, I think, and that's proven to be the case because, and that's why I like these food habits reports, because sometimes, I think we're looking for concentrated food sources, I guess, where there's some regular or seasonal visits. And I haven't really found that. They're pretty wide-ranging. It seems to be half in the diet, maybe half vegetation, half meat. Yeah, pretty adaptable, it seems.
Yeah, it's kind of a hard question to answer. The primatologist I was telling you about, he told me one time, he said, Wes, if you ever want to go find great apes in the wild, good luck. And good luck getting them on camera. He said, because they will sit in the bushes and you will walk right past them and not even know they're there. And he goes, there's a lot of correlations between the Sasquatch and what great apes do. And he said it's not easy to find a non-human primate like you would think. They're very elusive. They're very cautious of humans. They're very, I know we hear Jane Goodall and everyone thinks she just showed up and the chimps welcomed her, and that's not the case.
No.
And so... No, go ahead, John.
I'd like to comment on that, because that's right. That Jane Goodall situation, I've studied her work, and she makes the point at the beginning. She was about 9 months in the forest, knowing chimps were around, hearing them occasionally, not a peek at one. And then one day, I guess she got too close to them, and they started intimidation. There was hooting and panting and sticks being thrown, and they displayed. It's called the intimidation display, and that was her good introduction. Well, so we don't hear much about that. We hear much about her later times when there was the provision of food and the chimps in the camp and all that sort of thing. But no, it took her a long time. Very good point.
And I don't want to keep you, John, but one of the last questions I wanted to ask you that wasn't really Bigfoot related. You made the move from central Canada to I believe it was Ontario, wasn't it?
That's right. Yep.
To BC, and it was mainly to research the Sasquatch reports, if my memory is right from what you told me. And I always wanted to ask you, how in the heck did you ever talk your wife into that? I mean, that's a good woman. That's a keeper right there.
She is.
How in the world did you?
That's. I got to. You know what I thought you were going to say. There's some very good Sasquatch reports coming out of Ontario, John. Why did you move? And I'm actually studying the Sasquatch and collaborating with researchers back there now. Anyway, that's an aside. No, actually, you live on the West Coast. It really, Vancouver, how did it go? Yeah, I did. I had a consulting assignment in Jasper National Park in Alberta at one time, and we had a break and drove out to the coast here to Vancouver Island, and it was pretty nice. I mean, for a biologist, a birder, the marine mammals. I was still a hunter at the beginning. The birding was pretty good. Nice climate. There was, I loved seafood. There were a lot of attractions, so it really wasn't all that hard. And Ontario's nice, but it's not that great.
I hear you. Well, if the audience gets a chance, go to sasquatchbiologist.org and pick up John's books, The Discovery of the Sasquatch and the North American Great Ape, the Sasquatch, off John's website, and go subscribe to his YouTube channel. I'll put a link in the description. Definitely, I mean, it's probably some of the best presentations I've ever seen, and I highly recommend it. If you can, subscribe, and go through his videos. I've been posting them like crazy, and every time you put one up, John, I put it up on the website. And I really appreciate you coming on. I've really enjoyed talking with you.
Well, I've certainly enjoyed. I need a boost. I'm kind of out of the loop up here, and you've been very encouraging. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John. And that's it for tonight, everyone. Remember, if you've had an encounter, shoot me an email. My email address is wes@sasquatchchronicles.com. And if you get a chance, check out the website. You can become a member. You can get merchandise. If you get a free moment, please check out sasquatchchronicles.com. Until next time, everyone.
Something a quiet time with the lights on.